mentioned that you have the opportunity to ask questions following the sermon. I believe that my mic is hot. If you have a question, I believe we have a microphone. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. That way it'll get onto the camera or the presentation this morning. Who has the first question?
Why do you think that these days everything, like if women are labeled, you know, the women, like feminists will come out and they'll say, well, women are always labeled, but men are never labeled, you know, like by saying harlot or something. So why do you think that the Bible refers to the woman as the adulteress, the woman is the harlot, and it don't really have a label for the man? Like they never really call a man a harlot in the Bible
Right.
or anything.
Yeah. I think the Bible does have a label for the men. Yeah. I mean, if we read the Bible for what it says, the man is just as guilty as the woman. But the feminists come out and say those kinds of things because they don't really believe the Bible, they don't read it. And so they basically, what they're really saying is there's nothing wrong with this activity. That's what they're really saying. They're not saying, well, why do we call the woman a harlot? We don't call the man anything. That's not what their point is. Their point is, we shouldn't be called a woman a harlot at all, because we should be accepting of this. And that's what they're really saying. Yeah, that's a new word, sex workers. The Bible doesn't fall into that kind of trap. I'll always look for what they're really saying. They always come out with something on fairness and equality. That's never what they're about. Never.
I just want to thank you for that sermon. All the years I've been in churches, I've never heard a sermon like that, and it's very needed, and maybe that's what's wrong, one of the things with our people.
Thank you for the encouragement.
Thank you.
Thank you for the encouragement. It's not these are not the fun messages. Some sermons can be fun. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, and maybe that's the right word, but I think it's okay to say that because I think Elijah did have one fun day. He may have had others, but I think he one day it was a fun day. He went back and said, you know, I think this prophet thing it does have its moments. It's good moments. Yes.
Just commenting on what the question Dan had, when the Bible, and Shaq mentioned it right after the question, but when the Bible talks about an adulterer, I always think of that. You know,
Okay.
when you know, you commit adultery, if it's adulterer, you adulterers, I always, and I think it is referring to the men.
Yeah. Well, yeah. James says that adulterers and adulteresses, he says. And you could argue that it's a worse term for a man in that sense, because a man is the one supposed to be defending his family, defending his wife. And whenever a man gets involved with this, he's not defending anymore, he's compromising their safety. It's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing. We can't play with it at all. There's no wiggle room here for this. Who else has a question?
In chapter 3, we talked about temple,
Yes.
but in plural, as being building the church.
Or corporate.
Did
Yeah,
I just,
the church is a temple, right.
did you want to review that? Just because we're talking about building, this is the temple,
Right.
and the two so often get confused.
Yeah, when we, in fact, we talked about that when we were in chapter 3, you may or may not recall. Paul talks about the church being the temple. He's speaking corporately there, and we said later on we're going to talk about your bodies being the temple where God lives. I don't really know exactly how it all works together, but we do know in the Old Testament that God was very pleased. He was pleased to live with his people. And he did live with his people. He lived with the children of Israel in the cloud and the pillar of fire. He lived with them. Now, I don't really understand exactly how that works. The great God You look at Revelation, see what's going on in heaven. It's overwhelming what goes on in heaven. Decided that where he'd like to be is with his people. I don't get it. But he wanted to live with his people. We know this from Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7. We see something. We see that God says, listen, I want to live with my people. Stephen says, Solomon built him a house, but the whole time he wanted to live with his people. So he wants to live with his people individually, and he wants to live with his people corporately. How that exactly works, I can't exactly tell you, just like I can't exactly tell you how the Trinity works. But we do know that he wants to live in both. So this idea that I'm going to go off on the mountain all by myself, me and Jesus communing, well, you know what? God wants to live with his people in a temple, corporately, as a local body of believers. Paul is very clear on that, and my friends. If God wants to live with the Corinthian church, he wants to live in anything. He wants to live here, even us, even here, believe it or not. Thank you, John. Yes.
So for a guy or a girl who may or may not be stuck in it, what would be a practical outworking of what to do?
Yeah, I didn't get to that this morning. I'll get to that next week. But here's where here's where we have a problem. I believe it goes back to Psalm 32, as we read here this morning. Can you really confess that this is a great sin against God? And can you really be like Job, who we'll talk about next week, who made a covenant with his eyes? You see, I believe that an awful lot of folks, when we run into this, what they're really saying is, hey, I don't want to be connected with the consequences of this. I don't want to be entrapped by this. But I still want the option to indulge. That's what I want. And if that's how you approach it, you're never going to win. You have to flee. You have to run. And that starts with confessing that it's really wrong, and you're not going to do it anymore. I think a lot of what passes for confession nowadays isn't really confession. It's I just don't want to be connected with the consequences. Not, I want to get away from this forever and ever. I want to flee. I'm out. I'm done. I think that's a big difference. And sometimes counseling lets us get away with that. I mean, we're going to counsel and counsel and counsel. How many counseling sessions does it take to say, you know what, I'm not going to do this anymore. It's wrong. Shouldn't take too many sessions. I can think of one, 3 minutes, get paid by the hour, and lose my job as a counselor. I'll never make any money. Stop doing that. Now get out of my office. I make a terrible counselor. Who else? Who else has a question? Yeah, right here.
I have laryngitis today, so you can hear me. But, those of us who came to Christ in our adult years after we committed all these sins, then we walk our faith out. It seems like everything's glossed over in many cases. And if you don't grieve over your past sins, have you really repented over them? I mean, I think of my past sins, they come back to haunt me at times, and it grieves me. And so many people just are like real glib about it. Oh, I'm sorry, just move it. But it is, you really have to look at it square in the face and call it what it is, and really grieve over it.
We need to ask ourselves, what are we casual about what grieves Christ? If it grieves Christ, how are we casual? How's that working?
Right.
Thank you.